Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and since the patrons over on Patreon tied on the last poll, I will be covering the entire Second Battle of Manassas. If you would like to vote for the next animation, check out the Patreon page, the link is in the description below. The following is Part 2, August 29th, 1862, Sigel Attacks. August 28th saw Stonewall Jackson fail to defeat the division of Rufus King before darkness covered the battlefield. As the Confederates awoke the next morning ready for a fight, they found that King's men had left the field. The whole night the Union Army of Virginia and its commander John Pope attempted to make sense of the engagement that had just taken place. Pope believed that Jackson was on the run, and he was determined to catch him. The Union commander sent out orders to his commanders to move toward Groveton. However, his abrasiveness while in command caused acts of insubordination. General Philip Kearny, who Pope ordered to march immediately for Jackson's last known position, refused to move until dawn because he had marched his men dozens of miles out of the way according to orders from Pope, and refused to force his men to chase Jackson without a proper rest. Pope was also not aware where many of his units were located. He thought McDowell's corps was to the west of Jackson and ordered that corps to attack the rebels. In reality, McDowell's men were southeast of the Confederate position. Pope's vague orders did not help the situation either. In the early morning hours, Jackson shored up his lines. Jackson's position was undeniably strong, but it was not flawless. Most obviously the railroad excavation, which Jackson at first probably planned to use as a breastwork the entire length of his line, on close inspection provided an inconsistent and hence vulnerable bulwark. In some places the fills were too high and sheer to be used. Elsewhere the cuts too deep. In other places the excavation amounted to nothing at all. Probably for these reasons, Jackson's line did not follow precisely the unfinished railroad. On the left, Generals Gregg and Thomas availed themselves of higher ground behind the fill. On the right, General Taliaferro's division, now under General Stark after Taliaferro was wounded, used the excavation only for skirmishers and positioned his main line 200 yards behind a wooded ridge. Only in the center, where the ground on either side was flat and wooded, did the two brigades of General Ewell's division, now under General Lawton after Ewell's wounding the day before, position themselves immediately along the unfinished railroad cut. By 8 a.m., Union General Franz Sigel and his corps arrived on the battlefield. Although the Federals knew the general area of Jackson, they still had to feel their way blindly with skirmishers investigating the woods north of Groveton. Colonel Krzyzanowski's brigade of Brigadier General Schur's division made first contact with Jackson's line. As Krzyzanowski's men entered the woods, they pushed back General Maxcy Gregg's skirmish line. To counter the approaching enemy, Gregg sent the 1st South Carolina to engage with the enemy, fire 2 volleys, and charge them. When they made contact with the enemy, the overwhelming numbers of the Union brigades nearly encircled the rebels and forced the South Carolinians back. Gregg acted quickly and ordered the 12th South Carolina to strengthen the 1st's left. Together, the two southern regiments delivered a devastating attack against the New Yorkers. Krzyzanowski ordered the last of his regiments, the 75th Pennsylvania, to attack the flank of the 1st South Carolina. The two sides flung lead at one another until General Gregg could hold back no longer, and sent the 13th South Carolina into the 1st's right to counter the Pennsylvanians' advance. The back and forth between Krzyzanowski and Gregg lasted most of the morning. To the west, more Union brigades made their way towards Stonewall's lines. Divisions under General Schenck and Reynolds and Milroy's independent brigade of Virginians began to size up the situation, but a heavy barrage of artillery from the Confederates made known the need to silence those guns on their left. Reynolds dispatched George Gordon Meade's brigade across the turnpike with a battery under Captain James Cooper. Meade ordered the 13th and 4th Pennsylvania Reserves to accompany Cooper, who unleashed a devastating volley into the rebel artillery. Captain William Pogue pulled his battery out of the main line of artillery and began firing at Cooper. The exchange lasted for an hour, with both sides experiencing heavy casualties. Cooper was obliged to fall back, but only after causing sufficient damage and taking pressure off of the Union infantry being harassed by the Confederate artillery. In the center of the Union line, Milroy's independent brigade heard elements of Schur's brigades on his right engaging with the Confederates, and without knowing the situation ordered 2 of his regiments, the 86th Ohio and the 5th Virginia, to attack the rebel line. In front of his troops were parts of Stark and Lawton's divisions, mostly the troops of Isaac Trimble and Bradley Johnson, some of them in the cut with wonderful cover from the enemy fire. The excavation presented a formidable obstacle here. Except for a 100-yard gap in the field known ever after as the dump, nearly 100 yards wide, the dump marked a no-man's land between Stark and Lawton's divisions. 5 years before, construction workers had begun to fill the gap by dumping stones into it, hence its nickname. But the work on the project was never completed. The 82nd's left companies struck the dump and pushed back the defenders, but the rest of the regiment and the 5th Virginia began taking heavy fire from the well-defended rebels. The 82nd's commander was killed and both regiments began to fall back in disorder. Milroy, seeing his men fall back, ordered the 2nd Virginia to support the Ohioans, but the lead flew so thick from the Confederate rifles that all 3 regiments fell back. In a last-ditch effort, Milroy prepared the 3rd Virginia for an advance. Captain David Gibson of Company H walked up to his regimental commander, Major Theodore Lang. As Lang remembered it, a face as calm and spiritual as if he had been preparing for the march to the bridal altar. "Major, I shall be killed in this charge," Gibson said. Lang tried to brush off Gibson's gloom with some pleasant words, but Gibson was not dissuaded. "I tell you I am going to be killed in this charge. I knew it last night. I have known it all morning." Gibson's earnestness impressed Lang. His voice and manner were so changed that I begged him not to make the charge, but he would not listen to that. The 3rd advanced, and in the early movement, Gibson was struck in the head by a rebel bullet, fulfilling his premonition. The Virginians, soon to be West Virginians, made a gallant stand, but could not withstand the rebel volleys, and retreated back to safety. With the disordered retreat of Milroy's brigade, the Union center was vulnerable. The blue troops thus far had attacked in piecemeal fashion, getting pushed back each time by the well-protected rebel lines. On the right, the division of Philip Kearny was approaching the field and consulted with Schurz to launch attacks as his brigades made it to the front. Kearny was determined to break Jackson's left flank. He ordered Schmiffelnick's brigade to Krzyzanowski's right. In the gap that remained, Kearny sent the 1st New York. Krzyzanowski's men had fought with Gregg's regiments for over an hour, and now, with support, the Federals converged on the South Carolinians. Gregg's men held on, but just barely, as Federal rifle fire decimated their ranks. The 12th South Carolina's commander, Colonel Barnes, took a risk. He ordered his regiment to charge. The fury of the Southerners sent the 1st New York into a panic, along with the 54th New York and the 8th Virginia. Schurz saw his men sprinting for the rear and immediately ordered the newly arrived 29th New York to halt the South Carolinians, but the momentum of the rebels sent the New Yorks into retreat, like the comrades they were sent to help. The 1st South Carolina was able to take up a position on the 12th's right. Schurz reformed the 29th and 54th and sent them back into the fray, but the Southerners pushed them back once again. By this point, Gregg's regiments were exhausted and running low on ammunition, so he pulled all of his regiments north of the unfinished railroad and awaited for the Federals to advance on him. He would get his wish. Schurz would receive a copy of a letter from Sigel to Kearny. In it, Sigel requested Kearny to launch his entire division against Jackson's left. With the knowledge that support would soon be filing into his right, Schurz complied with the orders and ordered his entire division, 2 brigades under Krzyzanowski and Schmiffelnick, against Jackson's left to help break the Confederate battle line. He also ordered up 2 mountain howitzers carried into battle on the back of mules to the front line. Infantry and artillery moved forward against A.P. Hill's division. Both sides exacted high casualties on one another. The Union troops stayed inside the tree line in the brush to conceal themselves, forcing the Confederates to aim at muzzle blasts from the Federals. Schurz's men kept holding their position, expecting help to come in the form of Kearny's division on their right, but it didn't come. For 2 hours, the blue troops doggedly held their position. Thank you all so much for watching. The next part will be uploaded next week. If you'd like to support the channel, please check out the Patreon page, consider subscribing, and stay tuned for more animated battle maps.